I'll start with a quick little intro note, and then we'll kick it off. My name is Adam Bassiano. I work here at the Israel Policy Forum in New York City. I'm the National Director for IPF Atid, which is the Israel Policy Forum's young professional network and initiative. And we really love looking into these ways to connect our community, perhaps during the workday, sometimes post-work, but certainly to connect folks from around the country, and most importantly, to connect our community with leaders and experts like yourself, Tanya, who are working on the ground on these important issues, and for us to engage with you and to think about how our community can support your efforts. Tanya is the executive director of Gisha, a position that you have held for a handful of years. I won't go too much into your bio, but Gisha works predominantly in the Gaza Strip, working on humanitarian and freedom of movement issues for Gazans, and it is an Israeli nonprofit organization. And I think, I guess one note quickly on the format of our conversation. I have just a handful of questions to guide the start of our conversation, and then we'll open it up to folks to ask whatever's on your mind for Tanya. There are a handful of different ways you can ask questions. As you can tell right now, the only video feeds you can see are my own and Tanya's. If you have a question, there's an option to click raise your hand. You might see it for those who are on your computers. That signals to me that you have a question, and I can then promote you for your video feed or audio to be looped in, and you can ask the question live. There's also a chat feature that you can use to ask your question, or if you're not on the Zoom app, you can email in a question to atid@ipforum.org, and we're monitoring that to see if we get any questions. With that, I think I'll start with an easy question for you, Tanya. If you want to share a little bit more about yourself and the work that Gisha is doing right now.
Sure. So I'm Tanya. It's really nice to be with you today, and thank you to the Israel Policy Forum for initiating this conversation. I think, I can always talk about Gaza, but certainly it's not always on the agenda. And I think in this day and age, a lot of things are happening that are of concern to your community and certainly mine. So I want to thank everyone for joining the call and for taking the time to talk about this important issue. So as you might hear from my voice, I have a very nice American accent. It's not just because Israelis speak English very well. I'm actually American and Israeli. I was born in Israel and raised in Los Angeles. I decided to come back to Israel about 11 years ago, and I found work pretty quickly with Gisha. So for young people in your community who are thinking about how to engage and get work, that was actually where I was starting at when I came to Israel 11 years ago. I had just finished a master's program in New York, and I wanted to see what I could do to contribute to, I think, a meaningful future, both for Israelis, for Palestinians, and for Americans. Being both Israeli and American, I felt a particular responsibility and also an investment in trying to contribute to the situation here. So I came and I found work very quickly with Gisha, and Gisha does focus, like you said, on freedom of movement. And I think for people like myself who grew up going back and forth between Israel and the United States, it was really easy to connect with this issue of freedom of movement. It's something that you don't really think about until you have it taken away. And once I saw the situation for particularly young Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, I felt very connected and wanted to continue doing the work. So I've actually been with Gisha for about 11 years. And I rose through the ranks and became director about 3 years ago. So that's my story and Gisha in a nutshell. In terms of the work that we're doing on a day-to-day basis, we are a legal organization. So we're providing legal assistance to individuals who need permits from the Israeli military to cross into and out of Gaza, and also to move goods into and out of Gaza. And then we're also working on a policy level through research, press work, media work, social media, etc., meetings with decision makers both in Israel and abroad, generally to try to expand freedom of movement and promote policies that we think are more conducive to both protecting human rights, and I would say more broadly to advancing well-being and regional stability as a whole.
Awesome. So another somewhat basic intro question. I think a lot of us on the call know and have interacted with the talking points when it comes to the situation in Gaza, especially post 2005 and 2007. Is there a lot of misinformation that's being spread when it comes to the situation in Gaza? And then a second follow-up question. Has the Israeli government's policy towards Gaza since the disengagement been consistent, and what does that policy look like?
Yeah. I think that the biggest myth when it comes to Gaza that's been actively promoted is that since the disengagement, Israel has nothing to do with what's going on in the Strip. So for those who might not be aware, in 2005, Israel did pull its military installations and settlements from inside of the territory of Gaza. What we say is it didn't relinquish control at that time, it simply reconfigured it. So control remained around the borders and the airspace at sea, over the population registry, collection of taxes, etc., in a way that impacts almost every aspect of day-to-day life. So I think that that's the predominant myth that we're coming up against, that once Israel left, anything that happened after that had nothing to do with Israel. Nothing could be further from the truth, unfortunately. And that is why we chose to focus on freedom of movement, because certainly there are all kinds of violations of rights happening in Gaza and in the West Bank, not just by Israel, but of course also by Palestinian actors. But as an Israeli organization, it was important to us to look at where Israel still has control in the Gaza Strip and what responsibilities then flow from that control. So the main way control is expressed today is through restrictions on freedom of movement, both movement of goods and movement of people, access for fishing, for farming, et cetera, a host of ways, like I said, that are that control is exercised and that is impacting the way people live their lives inside of Gaza. I think that another kind of myth that flows from that is essentially that that everything would have been rosy had Hamas not come to power in 2007. So you have a few important dates, 2005 and then 2007. And unfortunately, that's also not the case. If Hamas were to disappear tomorrow, I don't think that this would necessarily change the situation radically. I do think that it could lead to certain positive transformations, and we can talk about that if you're interested. But I think that when it comes to movement restrictions, actually the trend that we saw began well before Hamas came to power. So certainly the situation got a lot worse in 2007, but already starting in, some people would say, the 90s with the start of the Oslo process, in 2000 with the start of the Second Intifada, restrictions again getting worse. In 2005 with the disengagement, 2006, for example, with the elections, with the capture of Gilad Shalit in June of 2006, you had all of these kind of markers and then certain peaks in the kind of political landscape that led to changes in policy when it came to freedom of movement. So I think that it's important to have that perspective on things. That's not to say that we see past the presence of Hamas inside of Gaza or of legitimate security threats that Israel faces. But I think that we can have a better informed discussion about the situation if we're looking really at how the situation has evolved in the last few decades.
Hmm. And has the rationale for this consistent policy looking at freedom of movement for individuals and goods, has the rationale shifted over time, or has it been a security-based argument throughout?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So I think that there are a few kind of motivations or rationales for why the situation is what it is when it comes to movement and access. Certainly, a security argument has been made, but not only. So let's say that we kind of like to summarize that there are three main motivations. Let's say the first one is security. Not necessarily in a kind of ranking order, but let's say certainly security is one of the reasons why these restrictions have been sort of justified. I would say the second and major reason why restrictions on movement have been in place have been for political reasons and political motivations. And that has been most clear certainly since Hamas came to power. In 2007, Israel instated what it called economic warfare on the Strip. So it reduced travel for people and movement of goods, not because it was difficult to screen people or because it was hard to kind of monitor movement of people. No, it was a purely kind of politically motivated rationale that said we're going to harm the economy on purpose, kind of enact these sanctions in an effort to put pressure on either Hamas or on the civilian population, which would then put pressure on its government, supposedly. And that has been the case throughout these years. Now, we just saw it recently. Kerem Shalom, the only goods crossing between Gaza and Israel, was closed on July 10th. In response, Israel said to incendiary kites. Now, it wasn't that something that had to do with movement of goods, would have stopped these kites. It was that Israel thought that by closing the crossing, it could, I don't know, somehow cause people to stop sending these kites over. So I think that that's just one recent example of how clearly the political motivation is there as well. And I would say the third motivation, which is also very important, is the way that Israel considers its obligations or lack of obligations towards residents of Gaza. Israel's position is that its obligations towards residents of Gaza are minimal, and that they derived from the law of armed conflict, meaning Israel has to allow passage of humanitarian convoys, humanitarian aid maybe, but anything that it does beyond that, it sees as a kind of gesture of goodwill. So I think that when you take the situation in that framework, you see that its decisions are not necessarily just based on security. They're sometimes not even just based on this political rationale, but they're based on the fact they don't see themselves as obligated to allow access to a greater extent. So on the ground, this is translated, for example, in the actual criteria on what can travel through the crossings and who can travel through the crossings. It means that Israel would maybe allow people to visit their mother, a first degree relative, if she were gravely ill or if she had passed away, but they're not going to allow you to visit your mother if you just haven't seen her in 10 years. That's not considered humanitarian enough.
Mm-hmm.
So the rationale there isn't necessarily security based. It's not that you pose a danger and Israel's saying you pose a danger. There are criteria that say what is considered humanitarian or not. So that's a long answer, but generally speaking, unfortunately, no, security isn't the only reason why these restrictions are in place.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it's helpful to view it through different lenses. I think it'd be interesting for you to explain a little bit more in detail about what these restrictions actually look like.
Sure.
Whether or not you want to provide specific anecdotes about how your work translates into daily lives.
Yeah. So, we're really boggled down in all the details, and I would encourage those who are interested really to know more, to get in contact with us or visit our website. But generally speaking, to kind of give an overview, there are criteria for who can travel, so for who can receive a permit from the military. And that would be to travel either between Gaza and Israel or Gaza and the West Bank. Israel, of course, controls access to the West Bank completely for Gaza residents. So that means that even if a person were to travel outside of Gaza via Egypt, through Jordan, and try to go to the West Bank, they wouldn't be able to do so without a permit. So the criteria that are in place are what Israel calls exceptional humanitarian circumstances, with an emphasis on access for medical treatment. And you have three main categories of people who are eligible to request permits: medical patients and their companions, and then within that there are all kinds of criteria and restrictions. Merchants or traders, so these are mainly business people who are purchasing goods from Israel to bring into the Strip. And then a third category, which are other humanitarian cases. So like I mentioned, visits to first-degree family members. If you have a relative who is, sorry to put it so bluntly, but dead, dying, or getting married. And then other kinds of very strange exceptions that you find in the criteria. I always point out that, for example, the Palestinian national soccer team, they have always been on this list of criteria. So they've always been eligible to request permits, whereas other kinds of athletes weren't allowed at different periods of time. So that's the kind of other category that encompasses a number of other cases. The kinds of cases that we're bringing are sometimes within those criteria, but we're also trying to challenge them and expand them. So we've been bringing cases, for example, on behalf of students who want to study in the West Bank. They've been banned since the year 2000. Visits to family members who are not considered by Israel to be ill enough. Visits not just to first-degree relatives, but for example, to grandparents, to aunts and uncles, things like that. Access for professional training for meetings which are not considered humanitarian. That's the kind of bread and butter of our work on a daily basis. When it comes to movement of goods, the situation has changed over time, but generally speaking, there's a list of items that can't go in to Gaza. Israel refers to it as the dual-use list, but it includes a number of items that are needed for construction and for industry. Everything else in theory can go in, though there were periods of time when things like food, children's toys couldn't go in. A lot of people might remember that. That's not the case today. And then there's also criteria for what can exit the Strip and to where. So Israel, of course, again, controls all access from Gaza to Israeli markets and West Bank markets, which in the past were Gaza's most important markets. And it also controls actually access abroad. All exit of goods that's taking place today is happening via that one commercial crossing I mentioned, Kerem Shalom crossing. There's no exit of goods via Egypt. And we could talk about Egypt too, if that's of interest.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we did get a question from Egypt from Shelley that while we're on it, I think we can jump in. Sure. Shelley asks, what can be done to give people the ability to leave Gaza for a third country? Can they travel to Egypt through the Sinai? What role does Egypt play in increasing mobility in goods?
Sure. So Egypt is certainly an important player here. Egypt, of course, controls the Rafah crossing between Gaza and Egypt. And the way that Rafah has operated has certainly changed over time as well. Gisha's primary interlocutor is our own government, the Israeli government, but we've certainly been tracking trends at Rafah. We have a major report about the situation at the Rafah crossing, and we try to certainly look at the picture holistically. Now, Rafah is important, but it's really only important as a gateway to the outside world, and that's nothing to kind of sneeze at, and that's certainly important for a wide variety of needs inside of Gaza. For example, students, because they can't go to study in the West Bank, if the subjects they want to study aren't offered in Gaza, they need to go abroad, and usually they would do so through Rafah crossing. Travel to third countries usually takes place through Rafah crossing. When Rafah has been closed, Israel has allowed some people to travel via its own territory to go abroad. There's still a few hundred people who do that every month. Rafah, though, can't replace the crossings with Israel, at least for the near future. Now, there are some people who advocate for this to be the solution for Gaza. We certainly wouldn't say that. Gaza and the West Bank are certainly connected by a wide variety of kind of contexts and networks, be they familial, academic, economic, political, cultural, and certainly Gaza also has extensive ties with Israel. So in the near future, Rafah is important for access abroad, but it can't replace the needs that are dependent on access through Erez and Kerem Shalom crossing. One of the main things, like I said, is access for goods. So prior to 2007 and some of the major restrictions on access for goods, about 85% of the goods going out of Gaza were sold in Israel and the West Bank. So again, in the near future, Gaza is totally dependent on access to these markets for any kind of economic well-being. And even if Rafah were a crossing point that were used for exit of goods, which it's not, that wouldn't replace those markets and access to those markets.
Mm-hmm. So I'm at least a little bit familiar with the civil administration of the IDF that operates in the West Bank. When it comes to the Gaza Strip and your kind of audience from the Israeli government perspective, is it mostly political context who you work with, or is there an IDF division that is kind of still administering these crossings who you work with?
Yeah, certainly. The Gaza Coordination Liaison Administration, so the CLA as it's known, is operating at the Erez crossing, and they are the main address for our requests. They are working with their Palestinian counterparts who are present inside of the Gaza Strip, so officials that are appointed by the Palestinian Authority. That's also a kind of myth that's out there, that it's only Hamas inside of Gaza, that the PA isn't present at the crossings, that they have nothing to do with the situation. That's not true. Actually, the Oslo process is still alive in that sense in terms of permit requests and applications, which are still being passed from the PA to Israel, also when it comes to Gaza, both for movement of people and for movement of goods, actually.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And understanding that you obviously predominantly work in Israel and for the Israeli audience, how does Hamas play into your work, and how do they view your efforts or similar efforts from outside actors?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, as you can imagine, we don't have direct contacts with Hamas officials. Our primary interlocutors, like I said, are Israeli officials. Certainly they are the de facto government inside of the Gaza Strip, so they're running a wide range of kind of services for the population. They are, I'm sure, reading our materials, they're monitoring our activities, they're watching us, but our connections, are limited to kind of a technical level and other people who are de facto employed by the government that they're running there. I think generally speaking, you don't get a very nuanced kind of dialogue on the situation in the Gaza Strip from a variety of actors. And so I think that our struggle to have a kind of nuanced and informed conversation about the situation is, I think, a challenge across the board. So not just with our own government, not just with COGAT and members of the Israeli parliament, but certainly also with PA officials and with others. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I think we'll open it up for questions. I certainly have more that I'd like to ask, but we'll save those for later if there's time. I'll remind that you can chat in your question, or you can raise your hand through the Zoom app, and that'll signal that you're ready with a question, or you can email Atid at ipforum.org. And I know we just got a question by email. It's regarding how do you balance allowing more freedom of movement with the security and terror risks. And I would add to that, in your messaging to the Israeli public, how do you factor in that balance?
Mm-hmm. That's a really good question. I mean, I think that it's important to keep in mind that security isn't the basis for a lot of the restrictions in place. We're often arguing with COGAT, the main body in charge of the civilian policy in Gaza, about the criteria. So we're not even having a conversation about security most of the time. We're having a conversation about whether, for example, one of the cases we've brought to the attention of the courts is about the fact that Israel won't allow exit of processed foods from Gaza. So in recent years, it's changed its policy. It's allowing some more exit of goods to the West Bank and also a narrower subset of goods to Israel. But one thing it won't let out is like cookies and biscuits and ice cream, things that used to be sold from Gaza in the West Bank. And so the question here isn't, again, about whether a certain shipment can't be screened. It's not about the identity of the businesses who are trying to get the goods out. It's purely a criteria issue. And so I think that if we can have a conversation about that, we're kind of in a much better position. Security isn't the stumbling block. It's actually the political will to change the policy. We don't take any issue with Israel's legitimate need to screen people or goods that are crossing into and out of Gaza. We're not saying simply, open the gates and allow everything to cross. What we're saying is that security should be the only factor and should be the only basis for which goods are allowed or denied, or people are allowed or denied. And unfortunately, security isn't the issue here. It's a political decision to put pressure on the population, which is determining much of the policy. Mm-hmm. When it comes to speaking to the Israeli public, certainly, as you can imagine, again, security does come up. And I think that one of the ways that we try to, let's say, kind of bust this myth about the security issue is to point out these examples like I've shown, and to point out the very real people who are being affected by these policies. We have just so many cases, and I can tell you from our kind of day-to-day work, it's the best way to see how the policy really isn't about security. People being blocked to reach opportunities, to move goods, et cetera, in a way that I think only in the long run actually harms regional stability. And I think that that's also an important question to keep in mind, right? You have short, medium, and long-term security needs. And I think that you can't really ensure medium and long-term security if your kind of view of the short-term security needs are so narrow. There are 2 million people living in the Gaza Strip. The majority of them are young people. And if they don't have hope for the future, if there isn't any kind of functioning economy, I don't think that bodes well for Israel's security or regional security as a whole.
Mm-hmm. I think I and many on the call would agree with your assessment. What are the latest numbers of percentages of the population in Gaza as it relates to age and unemployment?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the current population is, people are saying between 1.9 and 2 million people. Second quarter statistics on unemployment, which are the most recently available statistics, show that about 53.7%, so almost 54% of the population is unemployed. When you look at the unemployment rate among young people, it's about 71%. So that's the category of age 15 to 29. So 70% of young people unemployed. And actually among women, it's 78% unemployment. So that was in the second quarter. My sense is that the third quarter statistics will be even worse because of these closures of Kerem Shalom crossing that I mentioned, and also cuts certainly to aid by the US, also sanctions imposed by the Palestinian Authority on Gaza, which have had a severe impact on employment rates. In terms of poverty levels, so I just read the UN's report to the AHLC meeting, which is happening tomorrow, and they're citing that the poverty rate is about 53% right now. A few years ago, it was 39%. That was in 2011. So poverty rates increasing. One thing I like to point out to people is the demographics of the population in Gaza. So of those 1.92 million people, about 70% of the population are under the age of 30, and about 53% are under the age of 18. So I think, again, if we're myth busting, if that's like one of the themes of this call, I think that when you talk about the situation in Gaza and you think about it, many people tend to kind of paint this broad stroke and say Gaza is Hamas, or Gaza is only terror. And I do think we need to keep in mind that actually the majority of the population of the Gaza Strip are children and young people with their attendant needs. And I think also raising real serious questions about the implications for the future if those young people don't have hope.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you. We have another question here from Shelley. How difficult is it for Israeli or West Bank residents to travel to Gaza? Can there be an increase of the flow of traffic into the Strip?
Yeah. That's a great question. So actually those criteria that I mentioned on who can get a permit, they're largely the same going in the other direction. So both coming out of Gaza and also going into Gaza. So if you'd like to go into Gaza, you have to also have a first-degree relative who is either dead, dying, or getting married. Israeli citizens are able to go in these circumstances, but that essentially limits it, of course, to only Palestinian citizens of Israel. So we are also in our work, we're helping individuals who have family members who are trying to go into Gaza. Many people also don't realize there are actually Israeli citizens living inside of Gaza. There are people who were maybe born in Israel and then moved to the Gaza Strip, got married, had children, etc. Their children would have been eligible for citizenship. We don't know how many people, but certainly something in the thousands. So that's an interesting kind of tidbit. When it comes to the criteria, it stayed pretty much the same over the years. So you have very, very few West Bankers or Israelis who are going in to Gaza. You have some people who are working for aid agencies who can go in, but again, not Jewish Israelis. And certainly I myself cannot go into Gaza. Our staff cannot go into the Gaza Strip. We rely on the work of our Palestinian colleague who's a resident of Gaza and is a full-time staff member with Gisha.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I'm sure there are challenges that come up every so often with your colleague who works inside the Strip.
He would like to come visit our office more often, but that's certainly very challenging.
Mm-hmm. Speaking more towards the policy-making sphere and the potential shifts, mm-hmm. Are there current proposals in the works, perhaps some that preceded some of the Trump administration cuts and some that are coming out as a result, that would look to shift the situation one way or the other? And I'd add, is it a right versus left conversation in the Knesset, or does it kind of challenge that?
Mm-hmm. I think generally speaking, there are a lot of Israelis and particularly security officials who are worried about the situation. And many of them have spoken out publicly about this. We actually have on our website a link to a document where we've compiled a list of quotes from Israeli officials citing what we call the security reconstruction nexus. And that's just a simple, or sorry, a complicated way of saying what I referenced before, which is if the situation doesn't get better, this will pose challenges, and already poses challenges to Israel's security. And so many security officials are pointing this out, and in there it's certainly not a right-left debate. I think when it comes to the current situation, rightfully so, a lot of people in Israel and abroad are concerned about the humanitarian situation, and there are certain kinds of initiatives. I think that the danger is in limiting ourselves only to the question of, is there a crisis? How can we stave off the crisis? And very few people, maybe rightfully talking more broadly about well-being, about development, about things that seem really like luxuries when it comes to the Gaza Strip. And my sense is that we cannot view this situation only from the perspective of there being enough water to drink or electricity. Those are the first things that we need to try to attempt to resolve. But we can't stop there. The situation is such that, like I said, if people don't have hope for the future, the situation will not drastically improve. And so, yes, they need access to clean water, they need more electricity, but I think that young people also need to feel like they have something to live for, and that they have hope to go to school, to study, to get jobs, to marry, etc. That's really the only way to achieve stability. And so I would say that most of the initiatives that we're seeing right now emerge from discussions are about just staving off imminent collapse of civilian infrastructure. At the UN, I'm sure that this is what they'll be discussing tomorrow, how they can shore up kind of more supply of water, more supply of electricity. And unfortunately, not a whole lot more because of the stalled political situation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that'll be interesting to follow what comes out of that meeting tomorrow. We have a question from Marianne. Does Gisha work with Israeli communities near Gaza who most closely experience the rocket strikes and might be more resistant to opening up movement?
Mm-hmm. So we do work with communities in the South, both with organized kind of institutions and also with individuals who are living there. And I think surprisingly, maybe to people who don't know, many people in these communities are actually the most vocal advocates for changing the policy on Gaza because they're in the line of fire. So certainly you have communities in the South also that are saying, hit them harder, who are saying, there are no civilians in Gaza. We see a lot of this, but we also see a lot of people saying, we see them, they're right there, they're over the fence, they're our neighbors. And if something doesn't change, this, risks our own well-being and our own security. So there are people who are active. And it has been our experience that, when these people speak in the Israeli media, in public events, they're listened to because they're in that direct line of fire. They have kind of ground to stand on. Unfortunately, though, the people who are kind of trying to preserve what they think is a status quo, I don't think such a thing exists, but the people who are trying to preserve a status quo are kind of hammering away at their talking points, and they're drowning out, I think, more reasonable voices that are saying, look, we need to change this situation. It's a matter of urgency.
And was there a letter that was recently penned from this summer from some community members near the Strip?
Mm-hmm.
Are you familiar?
Yeah, I mean, there have been a variety of initiatives. One initiative that we worked on with communities in the South, there was going to be an effort to reduce travel trucks on the road leading to the Kerem Shalom crossing, and several heads of communities down there signed a letter with us to try to prevent this. It became largely kind of a moot point when reductions in aid and the kind of stilted economic situation reduced that truck traffic anyway, so it's not as much of a pressing issue. But that was certainly an instance where communities kind of came together and said, hold on, anything that kind of stops movement of goods to an already vulnerable population, can't happen. So yeah, there have been a variety of initiatives by these communities.
Mm-hmm. And I know it's still pretty fresh and unclear, probably even to Knesset members, but viewing the U.S. administration's decision to cut much of the funding to various Palestinian institutions and agencies, are you starting to see some results of that, either whether or not it's on the ground or simply in rhetoric?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in terms of the kind of repercussions of that, many people have already been laid off. I haven't seen a lot of numbers publicly, but I know that dozens of staff of various aid agencies who were affected by cuts to USAID have already been laid off. I know that people in UNRWA, so the UN agency in charge of refugees, people have been laid off. So I think that right now, those were the immediate effects of these organizations kind of having to pull back on their programs. And I think it remains to be seen in the kind of medium term how the cuts will affect the situation. I think it's causing a lot of very well-placed anxiety among the population. One of the biggest challenges in the Strip, and many people know about, is the water and electricity situation. Now, people maybe don't realize, but because of the fact that there's not electricity, major civilian infrastructure and institutions depend on fuel for running generators when there's no power. So you have a network of hospitals, you have kind of water pumping stations, sewage pumping stations, basically needing this fuel in order to just continue their work. And the UN has actually been providing the fuel, and it purchases the fuel actually from Israel from its donations. So this is of major concern. I think that many people look at the situation in Gaza and say, people are always saying the crisis is almost here, and then quote unquote nothing happens. And the only reason for that is because of aid. Aid is the only thing that's separating the situation in Gaza from being one of dire poverty, very, very difficult conditions, to an utter and total disaster. And so I think that with the cuts to UNRWA, with the cuts to USAID, generally with donor funding kind of drying up for a variety of reasons, and competition on the global scene for crisis and disaster, I think that certainly this could have really dire consequences for a variety of kind of situations in the Gaza Strip, from kind of day-to-day life, people, jobs, et cetera, to these civilian institutions, hospitals not being able to provide services, et cetera.
And a lot of these aid organizations themselves, including UNRWA, right, are the primary employers, right, the biggest sources of employment in this.
Yes,
is that right?
certainly. Yeah, I mean, UNRWA cannot be replaced. I mean, one of the things that I've heard Trump and his administration talking about is perhaps even redirecting some of the funds it gives to UNRWA to other institutions. It's simply not possible. UNRWA is essentially running a parallel government inside of Gaza. They're providing primary care to over 1 million people. They're educating, I believe it's something like 500,000 children in schools. So, really it's irreplaceable, and any cuts really threaten their kind of functioning. I know that the donor community, you asked about how the international community is responding. certainly there have been efforts to kind of bridge the gaps in that funding by fundraising from other countries, et cetera. And I know that that has had some, limited success, but certainly the U.S. being the kind of primary donor to UNRWA, and USAID having been a major source of funding for a variety of programs in Gaza, there's no way to avoid this having a major impact in the Strip.
Mm-hmm. I understand. And perhaps we have time for one or two more questions. We have one that asks, can you help us understand the role of Fatah in the Strip? Does any political party have any chance of gaining power without using force?
Mm-hmm. No, that's a good question. Maybe outside of my realm of expertise, but one thing I will say, and I alluded to it before, is that the PA still has a very deep kind of presence in the Gaza Strip. So like I said, they're still running their side of the crossings in terms of being the interface with the Israeli army when it comes to movement of people and movement of goods. They've reduced payment of salaries to civil servants, but they're still paying salaries of many, many civil servants, tens of thousands of people who were employed by the government and who have essentially been paid, to sit at home. They're also paying for medical treatment for Gaza residents outside of the Strip, so in Israel or in East Jerusalem and West Bank hospitals. They're also paying for electricity that's purchased from Israel and supplied to the Gaza Strip. Now, they're also getting certain funding from the international community for Gaza. They're collecting taxes on goods that are going into the Gaza Strip. So it's not just that Gaza is kind of taking funds, they're also sort of giving back in a certain way, if you want to call it that. So their presence, the presence of the PA is very extensive when it comes to the Gaza Strip, and it's certainly a very complicated situation. The PA has apparently made a decision since last year to also try to put pressure on the population and put pressure on Hamas. It's not clear whether that's to get them to cede control or to improve their negotiating power with Hamas on a variety of issues. But certainly they have taken measures that have had an impact on the civilian population in Gaza, and I don't want to ignore that important impact. Reductions, for example, in allocations for fuel. For a time, they had reduced or requested that Israel reduce the supply of electricity. That's no longer the case, but it was very important and painful for Gaza residents. And like I said, also reductions in the salaries for civil servants. So these are just some of the ways that the PA has an influence. In terms of whether another political party can take power, my personal opinion is that the only way forward eventually will be to have elections in the Palestinian territory. There have not been elections other than municipal elections since 2006. So I think that if we believe in democracy, eventually I think that that's the only way to kind of radically, change the political situation in the Gaza Strip and in the West Bank. And I think that anything else is very anti-democratic. To kind of see the situation right now and say the PA needs to go back. You can have that opinion. But I think that at the end of the day, residents of Gaza and the West Bank deserve to have free and fair and open elections like anywhere else in the world.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Interesting. I think I'll, unless we have any final questions from our viewers, I'll tie in one last question with a wrap up. As a community with IPF Atid of certainly concerned yet focused young professionals around the country who are in support of the two-state vision, what types of resources and content from Gisha do you think we should be on the lookout for as we continue to stay up to speed on what's going on in the Gaza Strip.
Yeah. Well, to try to be brief, I know we don't have a lot more time, but I think that, hopefully I've given you guys some ideas in this relatively short conversation about ways to look at the Gaza Strip. And I think it's really important for people who are advocating for a solution and a peaceful resolution to the conflict in general, whether it be through one state or two state or 10 states. I think that Gaza is an important part of this picture and it can't be ignored. And so I think that going forward, in your advocacy, I would say it's really important to kind of, again, have a nuanced conversation about what's happening there. Pay attention to the needs of the civilian population. Not stay only in the realm of the kind of political discussions and the kind of arm wrestling between the various authorities, etc. I think that a kind of real honest push for progress when it comes to Israel-Palestine can't ignore the people that are on the ground and their needs and rights. So in terms of resources from us, Gisha is going to be publishing or putting out some short films in the near future. We have a variety of resources on our website. We try to kind of produce short and factual information, a number of reports, and we're certainly very open to kind of inquiries and questions, from people who are trying to kind of advocate in a fair way about these issues.
Great. Well, certainly if I have additional Gaza questions, I know who to reach out to.
Yeah.
On behalf of the Israel Policy Forum and IPF Atid, I would like to, of course, thank you for joining us and spending time with us this afternoon and evening in Israeli time.
Yeah.
This call kind of helps bookend our third quarterly initiative of 2018, in which IPF Atid focuses on various segments of the kind of two-state solution Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And we were spending the past 3 months focusing on the Gaza Strip and various questions surrounding it. So we certainly appreciate your insights and expertise on this important component. And we hope to have you on again soon for a conversation with us.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Best of luck moving forward, Tanya, with Gisha. Thank you.
Yeah, good luck to you guys as well.
Take care.